She had been warned about him before she ever set foot in the palace. Every maid, every courtier, every whisper in every corridor said the same thing. Do not look directly at the Duke of Ashenvale. Do not speak to him unless spoken to. And above all else, do not let him notice you. Lady Seraphina Calloway had nodded politely at every warning. She had smiled, tucked each one neatly into the back of her mind, and proceeded to do the one thing no woman in the court had ever dared do. She sat beside him. Not because she was bold. Not because she was reckless. She sat beside him because the royal carriage lurched violently on the mountain road. The only empty seat was next to the man they called the Black Duke, and her legs simply gave out before she could find another option. She expected him to be furious. She expected cold silence, a cutting remark, perhaps even a command to remove herself immediately. What she did not expect was the slow, almost imperceptible way his head tilted. The way his iron shoulders dropped half an inch. The way the most feared nobleman in the entire kingdom of Valdemir closed his eyes, exhaled once through his nose, and fell deeply, soundly asleep against her shoulder. The carriage went quiet. Every other passenger stared. And Seraphina Calloway sat perfectly still, heart hammering against her ribs, afraid that if she moved even a single inch, whatever spell had just fallen over the dangerous, untouchable Duke of Ashenvale would shatter, and she would have to face what came after. She did not move. She barely breathed. And somewhere between the first mountain pass and the second, she realized with slow, dawning horror that she did not want to. Subscribe. Before we continue this story, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. Every week we bring you the most breathtaking royal romance stories, full of forbidden love, powerful men, fearless women, and all the drama that unfolds when two worlds collide. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. Now let us return to Seraphina and the Duke who was never supposed to notice her. The Court That Whispers. The kingdom of Valdemir sat nestled between two mountain ranges like a jewel pressed between the fingers of giants. Its capital city, Ashenmere, was famous for three things across the known world. Its white marble towers that caught the morning light and turned it to gold. Its legendary royal court, which had produced more political intrigue per square foot than any other institution in recorded history. And its Duke. Caelan Duskmore, the Duke of Ashenvale, was not merely powerful. Power was a word people used for kings and generals, for men who commanded armies or signed treaties. Caelan Duskmore was something else entirely. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made every other person in it reconsider their choices. He was 34 years old, with the kind of face that painters attempted and failed, sharp jaw, deep-set gray eyes the color of a winter sky just before a storm, dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that looked entirely unplanned but somehow always perfect. He was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not just in measurement but in presence. He wore deep charcoal and midnight blue exclusively, never gold, never the warm colors of celebration. His riding coat always bore the silver crest of Ashenvale, a raven mid-flight over a crescent moon. He had earned his reputation through a combination of factors that court gossips delighted in cataloguing. At 22 he had dissolved a trade alliance that 3 kingdoms had spent a decade building, with a single letter. At 26 he had uncovered a conspiracy within the royal treasury that had implicated 4 noble families and resulted in 2 exiles and 1 very quiet abdication. At 30 he had stood before the full court assembly and told the king, calmly and without blinking, that the proposed marriage alliance with the Northern Territories was not merely inadvisable but was, in his exact words, the most strategically illiterate decision this throne has produced in 2 generations. The king had not spoken to him for 6 months. The alliance had collapsed 8 months later, exactly as Callan had predicted. After that, no one questioned him. They simply stepped aside. Serafina Calloway had heard all of this second-hand, third-hand, and approximately 12th hand by the time she arrived at the royal palace of Ashimere as a newly appointed lady-in-waiting to Princess Isolde. She was 23, the second daughter of a minor noble house from the coastal province of Mierenfeld, chosen for the position not because of her family's influence, which was modest at best, but because of her extraordinary education, her fluency in 4 languages, and the quiet recommendation of the royal librarian, who had corresponded with her for 2 years about a rare collection of maritime histories she had helped catalogue back home. She arrived on a gray Tuesday morning with 2 trunks, a leather satchel full of books, and absolutely no illusions about where she stood in the hierarchy of palace life. She was not a great beauty by court standards, though she was far from plain. She had warm brown skin that glowed golden in good light, deep brown eyes with a slight upward tilt at the outer corners, and thick dark hair she kept pinned back in elaborate styles that the palace maids immediately offered to improve upon. She was of medium height, slender but not delicate, with hands that were slightly ink-stained at the fingertips from a lifetime of writing and a habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking that her mother had always called her Tell. The palace assigned her a small but beautiful room in the east wing, overlooking the courtyard gardens. Within 3 hours of arrival, the head lady of the chamber, a brisk woman named Lady Orvain, had walked her through the rules of court conduct, the schedule of Princess Isolde's daily engagements, and a comprehensive verbal map of everyone she should avoid. The Duke of Ashenvale was first on that list. Never initiate conversation. Never position yourself in his direct line of sight if it can be avoided. Never, under any circumstances, respond to his observations about you as though they are invitations to a longer exchange. He does not make friends. He does not take interest. If he speaks to you, answer briefly and remove yourself. Serafina had listened, nodded, and gone to bed that night thinking about maritime trade routes and the best way to organize the princess's correspondence. She had not been thinking about gray eyes or the smell of wood smoke and cedar that people apparently associated with the Duke's presence. She had not been thinking about him at all. She met him for the first time on her 5th day at court. It was not a dramatic meeting. There was no moment of locked gazes across a crowded ballroom, no spark of awareness across candlelit marble. She was walking quickly through the west corridor carrying a stack of leather-bound books for the princess, turned a corner she had not yet memorized, and walked directly into a wall that turned out to be a man. The books fell. She stumbled. A hand caught her elbow before she could follow the books to the floor. She looked up. The Duke of Ashenvale looked down. Up close he was more unsettling than the descriptions had suggested, not because he was frightening exactly, but because his face was so entirely still. Not cold. Not angry. Just utterly controlled in a way that made her feel slightly transparent, as though he was noting something about her and filing it away without expressing any reaction to it whatsoever. He released her elbow. He bent down and picked up two of the books. He looked at the titles. Something moved very slightly at the corner of his mouth. He set them on top of the stack she had reassembled and straightened. He said nothing. He walked away. Serafina stood in the corridor for a full 4 seconds before her legs remembered how to work. She told herself it was because she had been startled. She told herself it was the unexpectedness of the encounter and not the particular quality of his silence, which had felt, inexplicably, less like dismissal and more like consideration. She went to deliver the princess's books and did not think about it again. Or she tried not to. Princess Isolde was 20 years old, fair-skinned with strawberry blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that she used with considerable skill to appear younger and more artless than she actually was. She was, in fact, extraordinarily shrewd, with a gift for reading people that she had cultivated carefully and concealed even more carefully. She had requested Serafina specifically after seeing one of her letters to the royal librarian, not for the content, though the content had impressed her, but because of the handwriting. You can tell everything about a person from how they write, she told Serafina on their 3rd day together, examining one of Serafina's cataloging notes. Yours is precise but not rigid. You correct yourself without erasing. You leave space for margin notes. You are organized but you do not panic when things are not perfect. Serafina had said, carefully, that she was not certain handwriting revealed all that much about character. Isolde had smiled. That, she said, is exactly what someone with good handwriting would say. They had gotten along beautifully from that point forward. It was Isolde who first told Serafina the full story of Kaelin Duskmore, not the court gossip version but the version that people who had watched him grow up knew. He was not always like this, Isolde said one afternoon, while Serafina read correspondence aloud and the princess embroidered with aggressive precision. He was different as a boy. My mother knew his mother well. They were friends when they were young. His mother died when he was 12 and his father, who was already a difficult man, became impossible after that. Kaelin was sent away to study in the northern academies at 14. He came back at 18 already built like that. Like a fortress. My mother said she could see the boy he had been underneath it, if she looked carefully enough. But most people do not look carefully enough. Serafina thought about the almost imperceptible movement at the corner of his mouth when he had seen the titles of the books she was carrying. She did not mention it. She was not sure why she did not mention it. She told herself it was because it was not relevant. She told herself that a great many things. The Mountain Road. 3 weeks after her arrival, Princess Isolde was summoned to attend a diplomatic convening at the mountain estate of Lord Valden in the northern reaches of the kingdom. It was a 3-day journey by royal carriage, and the princess's party included 4 ladies-in-waiting, 2 senior court advisors, a small contingent of royal guards, and, because he had been appointed by the king as official diplomatic observer for all engagements with the Valden family, the Duke of Ashenvale. Serafina learned this on the morning of departure. She did not panic. She arranged her expression, secured her trunks, and took her assigned seat in the second carriage, which was also, as it happened, the Duke's assigned carriage, along with Lady Orvaine and a senior court advisor named Lord Pethin, who was 70 years old, almost entirely deaf, and fell asleep before they had cleared the palace gates. Lady Orvaine sat as far from the Duke as the carriage allowed and spent the first hour of the journey examining her correspondence with the focus of a woman who has decided that whatever happens in this carriage is simply not her concern. Serafina sat with a book open in her lap and her eyes on the passing landscape and was acutely, continuously aware of the man sitting diagonally across from her. He was reading. He read the way he did everything, with total stillness, his long fingers holding the pages lightly, his eyes moving in steady measured lines across the text. He had not looked up since they departed. He did not appear to be aware that other people existed. For the first hour, Serafina was grateful for this. For the second hour, she found herself almost irritated by it, which she recognized as irrational and set aside firmly. For the third hour, she stopped thinking about him altogether because the carriage road had begun climbing into the first mountain pass and the view outside her window had become extraordinary. She pressed close to the glass without meaning to, watching the valleys open below them, the pale green of the lowland forests giving way to the dark pines of the higher altitude, the light changing quality as they ascended, becoming sharper, colder, more blue. She said, entirely without intending to, "That is remarkable." A pause. She turned, and found the Duke looking at her. Not at the window. At her. He said, after a moment, "The second pass is better." She blinked. He looked back at his book. Serafina faced forward again. Lady Orvaine had not looked up from her correspondence. Lord Pethin was audibly asleep. She was not sure what had just happened. She was not sure whether it had been a rebuke or something else. She turned it over carefully in her mind and concluded, cautiously, that it had possibly been something else. She watched the second pass approach through the glass. She did not say anything when it came into view. But she heard, from across the carriage, the faintest sound of a page not being turned. The road through the third mountain pass was where everything changed. A late-season storm had softened part of the road surface, a fact that the advance outriders had apparently failed to communicate clearly enough to the carriage drivers. The vehicle hit the compromised section at speed, lurched violently to the right, was corrected with a sharp jerk to the left, and then dropped heavily into a rut that sent every passenger in the carriage into ungraceful contact with whatever surface was nearest. Lord Pethin did not wake up. Lady Orvane clutched the door handle and made a sound of contained distress. Seraphina, who had been mid-sentence in a new paragraph and leaning slightly forward, was thrown back against her seat. The momentum of the correction carried her sideways. The seat beside her was occupied. She found herself pressed against the Duke of Ashenvale's shoulder. She straightened immediately, or tried to. The road was still unsteady. She pulled back, apologized quietly, and found a handhold on the window frame. He said nothing. The carriage stabilized. Lady Orvane checked her correspondence for damage. Lord Pethin slept on. Seraphina sat carefully upright and looked out the window and did not allow herself to be aware of how close she was still sitting, because the carriage was not large and the incident had rearranged the geography of everyone's positions. She did not know when it happened. She was not watching for it. She was reading again, or attempting to read, her eyes moving over the same sentence for the fourth time, when she became aware of a change in the quality of the air to her left. A wait. Slight, but definite. Warm. She turned her head very slowly. The Duke of Ashenvale's head had come to rest against her shoulder. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and even. His entire face, which in waking carried the compressed vigilance of a man who was always observing, had gone completely still in a different way. Not the controlled stillness of watchfulness. The unguarded stillness of sleep. He was asleep. Against her shoulder. Seraphina did not breathe for a long moment. Across the carriage, Lady Orvane looked up from her correspondence. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Seraphina. Her expression was not readable. She looked back down at her correspondence and did not look up again. Seraphina sat perfectly still. Her shoulder was warm where his head rested. She could feel the slight weight of him, not heavy, just present, real. His dark hair was very close to her cheek. She could smell cedar and something cold, like the mountain air had been folded into his coat. She thought about waking him. She thought about shifting away slowly, giving him the opportunity to straighten without awareness. She thought about a dozen practical, sensible responses to the situation. She did not move. The road smoothed out. The carriage moved steadily through the mountain pass. The light outside turned the pale gold of late afternoon. Lord Pethin snored once, settled, went quiet. Lady Orvane turned a page. And Seraphina Calloway sat with the most feared man in the kingdom of Valdemir asleep on her shoulder and felt, to her own considerable bewilderment, completely, inexplicably calm. He woke 40 minutes later, somewhere on the far side of the second pass. She felt it happen, the slight change in his breathing first, then the almost imperceptible tension that returned to his shoulders as consciousness reclaimed him. He did not move immediately. There was a pause, brief but distinct, in which she had the odd sense that he was aware of exactly where he was and choosing, deliberately, how to respond to it. He straightened. He was quiet for a moment. He said, without looking at her, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, "I apologize." She said, also quietly, "There is nothing to apologize for." Another pause. He looked at her then. It was a direct look, not assessing exactly, but searching. As though he was checking something. As though her answer had raised a question he had not been expecting. He looked away again. He picked up his book and did not speak again for the rest of the journey. But when they arrived at the Valden estate and the carriage door was opened and the party disembarked into the cool mountain evening, Serafina noticed that he descended first, turned, and held out his hand without being asked. She took it. It lasted exactly as long as it needed to and not a moment longer. She did not mention it to anyone. The estate and what it uncovered. The Valden estate was extraordinary and slightly foreboding, which Serafina was beginning to think might be a defining characteristic of everything at this altitude. It was built into the face of the mountain itself, pale gray stone with towers that seemed to grow organically from the rock, connected by covered walkways and internal passages that meant one could walk the entire complex without ever stepping outside. The great hall had a ceiling that rose to 40 feet and was carved entirely from the mountain's own stone, and the fireplace in it was large enough to roast 3 oxen simultaneously, which Lord Valden seemed to find an appropriate detail to mention during introductions. Princess Isolde navigated the social opening of the convening with her usual blend of warmth and steel. She was here to discuss the renewal of the Northern Passage agreements, a complex negotiation that involved grazing rights, toll structures on the mountain roads, and the somewhat delicate question of which kingdom's administrative courts held jurisdiction over disputes in the borderlands. Serafina's role was to manage correspondence, provide language support if needed in the northern dialects, and generally ensure the princess had what she required. She was good at this work. She liked it. There was a satisfaction in the precision of it, in being the person who anticipated rather than reacted, who had the document ready before it was requested, who spoke the language before the translator was summoned. She had always found more comfort in being useful than in being noticed. The first evening passed without incident. Dinner was formal, long, and heavy with the kind of political subtext that turned every sentence into a chess move. Serafina sat at the lower end of the table with the other ladies and junior staff, close enough to observe the primary table and far enough to be invisible, which was the precise geography she preferred. She watched the Duke of Ashenvale over the candles. He sat 2 seats to the left of Princess Isolde, between a senior Valden advisor and an elderly countess who seemed to be attempting to draw him into conversation with heroic persistence. He responded to her with what appeared, from a distance, to be civil brevity. He ate little. He drank 1 glass of wine and did not refill it. His eyes moved around the room at measured intervals with the quality of someone who is not being watchful for social reasons but for something else, something more fundamental, like a person who learned a very long time ago that safety comes from knowing every exit and every face before either is needed. Serafina looked away before he could catch her watching. He caught her watching on the second evening. She had been less careful. The dinner was less formal, the seating more fluid, and she had allowed herself to drift toward observing the main table more openly than she should have. His expression did not change. But he held the contact for a deliberate, unmistakable second before returning his attention to Lord Valden. Serafina picked up her water glass and took a careful sip and told herself that direct eye contact at a dinner table was a normal occurrence and meant absolutely nothing. She told herself this 3 more times before she believed it at a functional level. The event that changed the tenor of the visit entirely happened on the second morning. Serafina had risen early, as was her habit, to prepare the princess's morning correspondence before the day's formal sessions began. She had taken her materials to one of the estate's covered walkways, which overlooked a courtyard where the mountain air came through the arched openings cold and sharp and wonderfully clear. She was working through a stack of letters, sorting by urgency, when she heard voices below in the courtyard. She was not eavesdropping. She was already there. The voices carried up. 2 men. Lord Valden and a second voice she did not immediately recognize. They spoke in the northern dialect, which they presumably assumed no one in the visiting party understood. Serafina understood it fluently. What she heard made her set down her pen very carefully. The conversation was not about grazing rights or toll structures. It was about the princess. Specifically, it was about a clause that Lord Valden intended to propose in the final day's negotiations, a clause that contained, buried in the administrative language of border jurisdiction, a provision that would effectively give the Valden family the right to approve or refuse any future royal marriage that affected territorial claims in the northern borderlands. Which, given how the borderlands were defined, meant any royal marriage at all. It was not a diplomatic proposal. It was a constraint on the crown. Framed in the language of administration, dressed in the vocabulary of territorial agreements, but fundamentally a mechanism of control. The princess, if she signed it without understanding what it said, which was clearly the intent, would be binding the throne of Valdemir to require Valden family approval for its own succession. Serafina sat very still on the walkway above them until the voices moved away. Then she put her correspondence in order, tucked it under her arm, and went to find the Duke of Ashenvale. She told herself she chose him because he was the diplomatic observer. She told herself it was purely procedural. She told herself she had not been thinking about the look across the dinner table or the feel of his weight against her shoulder on the mountain road. She told herself a great many things that morning. She found him in the estate's map room, which suggested he had either been told it existed or had found it himself, and she found it significant that she was not surprised to find him there. He was standing over a large table examining a topographical survey of the northern borderlands. He was wearing his riding coat, dark charcoal, the silver raven crest catching the early morning light. His hair was slightly less arranged than usual, as though he had come here directly from Rising, without the intervention of a valet. He looked up when she entered. She crossed the room. She set her correspondence on the edge of the table. She told him, in precise, calm language, exactly what she had heard. He was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he did not immediately respond. He looked at the topographical map for a moment, then back at her. He said, "You speak the northern dialect." She said yes. He said, "Fluently." She said yes. He said, "And you understood the full implication of what he described?" She said yes. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, not his court expression, not his political expression, but the other one. The one that appeared when he was not performing the version of himself he showed the world. He said, quietly, "Why did you come to me?" She said, "Because you are the diplomatic observer and this is a diplomatic matter. And because I did not think anyone else would know what to do with it." A pause. He said, "And you do?" She said, "I have some thoughts." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. More than the movement at the corner of his mouth she had catalogued before. Something that reached further, something warmer, something that appeared and then was controlled before it could fully arrive. He said, "Tell me your thoughts." She told him. It required understanding both the law and the people. It required knowing what someone wanted to achieve and also what they could not afford to appear to want. She had been good at this kind of thinking her whole life. She had simply never had the materials to apply it to before. He was extraordinary at it. He moved through the problem with a speed and precision that was almost unsettling, arriving at conclusions she was still building toward and then waiting, without condescension, for her to catch up and confirm them. He did not dismiss any of her thoughts. He modified them, questioned them, built on them. At the end of the hour they had a strategy. He looked at her across the map table and said, "You were not brought here as a language resource." She said, "I was brought here as a language resource." He said, "The royal librarian recommended you." She said yes. He said, "I know the royal librarian. He does not recommend people for administrative roles." She held his gaze. She said, "Perhaps he thought this particular role suited me." The thing that was almost a smile appeared again, and this time he did not entirely prevent it from arriving. He said, "I am beginning to think he was right." She picked up her correspondence from the edge of the table. She said, "I will prepare a written summary of the clause and its implications for the princess before the afternoon session." He said, "Yes. Do that." She walked to the door. He said, "Serafina." She stopped. He had not used her name before. She turned. He said, carefully, "Thank you." She said, "It is my job." He said, "No. It is not." She left. She walked back through the covered walkways to the east wing where her room was, and she sat at her writing table and picked up her pen and did not write anything for approximately 4 minutes because her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed her lips together. She recognized her tell. She told herself it was the altitude. Subscribe, like and share. The evening of telling. The afternoon negotiation session was remarkable for what did not happen. Lord Valden presented his proposed clause in the third hour of discussions, embedded in the middle of a long and deliberately tedious recitation of administrative language about border court jurisdiction. It was skillfully done. The sort of thing that was designed to be agreed to in the moment of general fatigue that follows 2 hours of procedural negotiation, when everyone wants to conclude and is likely to nod at language they have not fully parsed. Princess Isolde listened. She nodded in the appropriate places. She asked a clarifying question about the definition of territorial claims in the eastern borderland sector that was, on the surface, a simple administrative query. It was not a simple administrative query. It was the exact question that, once answered, would require Valden to explain the clause in enough detail that its true intent became visible in the official record. Serafina watched from her position at the side of the room, where she was seated with the other support staff, and saw the moment Lord Valden understood that the trap had not only been seen but had been turned. His answer was careful, constrained, and gradually stripped the clause of everything that made it dangerous, because to defend it he had to explain it, and to explain it was to expose it. By the time the session concluded, the clause had been reduced to a narrow, toothless provision about consultation protocols that carried no binding force whatsoever. He knew. He did not know how. But he knew. He looked, at one point during the session, at the Duke of Ashenvale. Kalen looked back with the mild, polite attention of a man who is following proceedings of only moderate interest and had no involvement whatsoever in anything that had just occurred. He was extraordinarily good at this. That evening, after the formal dinner which was notably more subdued than the previous two, Princess Isolde found a moment to speak privately with Serafina in the corridor outside the great hall. She said, "My diplomatic observer tells me I owe you a significant debt." Serafina said, "It was a matter of routine translation support." Isolde looked at her. She said, "My diplomatic observer says you came to him at dawn with a fully analyzed counter-strategy and a written legal summary." "That is not routine translation support." Serafina said she was simply glad to have been useful. Isolde said, quietly, "You are more than useful, Sarah. I want you to know that I see that. And I intend to ensure that the appropriate people see it too." Serafina thanked her. Isolde moved to go back into the great hall. She paused. She said, without turning, "He asked about you. Before we departed from the palace. He asked the librarian about you." Serafina was very still. Isolde said, "The librarian told me, because the librarian tells me most things. He asked who you were, where you were from, what your languages were, what else you could do. He asked more questions than he has ever asked about any member of my staff." She went back into the great hall. Serafina stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to find her book. She had been on the same page for 3 days. The storm came in the night. Not a violent storm, but a persistent one, the kind that closes a mountain pass for days at a time and turns a planned 3-day visit into an indefinitely extended one. By morning the snow was 3 feet deep against the estate's outer walls and the road back was impassable. They were staying. There was a specific social geography that developed over the following 2 days that Serafina became aware of gradually and then all at once. It was the geography of proximity. In a palace, the spatial distance between people was maintained by architecture and protocol. In an estate surrounded by snow with a finite number of rooms and a finite number of people, the distances compressed. She saw him at breakfast. She saw him in the library, where he spent his mornings and she spent hers. She saw him in the afternoon when the estate's small company gathered in the great hall because it was warmest there. She saw him at dinner and in the corridor after dinner and once, unexpectedly, at the very end of one of the covered walkways where she had gone to watch the snow falling in the courtyard below. He was already there. He was standing at the arched opening, his hands behind his back, watching the snow. He was not in his riding coat. He was in a simpler dark jacket, unbuttoned at the throat in a way she had not seen before. He looked different without the full armor of his formal court presentation. Not softer exactly, but more present somehow. More there. She almost withdrew. She considered it. Then she walked to the other arched opening and stood and watched the snow too. For a while neither of them said anything. The snow fell without sound in the dark. The courtyard below was entirely white, the stone fountains buried, the bare winter branches of the ornamental trees carrying improbable white weights. He said, eventually, "How long have you been reading Callaway Maritime Histories?" She blinked. She said, "How do you know about that?" He said, "The books in the corridor." When we collided, I recognized 2 of the titles. She said, "You know the Callaway Histories." He said, "My mother had a copy." It is an unusual text to be carrying to a princess's apartments. She said, "I am a Callaway. My great-uncle wrote the original volume. I have been working on an expansion. The princess allows me use of her library." He was quiet. He looked at her in the way that was not his court look. He said, "The second daughter of a minor coastal noble family. Fluent in 4 languages. Correspondent of the Royal Librarian. Expert in maritime history and, it emerges, political analysis. On staff as a lady-in-waiting." She said, "Is there a question somewhere in that?" He said, "Yes." "Why are you here?" She said, "I was appointed." He said, "You were recommended." There is a difference. The librarian recommended you. I asked about you and the librarian told me what you could do. I then suggested to the king's appointment secretary that a language specialist was needed for the princess's staff. The snow fell. Serafina looked at him. She said, "You recommended me." He said, "Yes." She said, "You had never met me." He said, "I had read your correspondence with the librarian. 3 years of letters." It was not an inconsiderable body of evidence. She looked at the courtyard for a moment. She said, carefully, "Why?" He said, because the princess needed someone capable. And because I found your letters interesting. She looked at him. He was watching the snow. She said, "You could have simply told someone that." He said, "I did tell someone. I told the appointment secretary." She said, "I mean you could have told me." A long pause. He said, "I am telling you now." The snow fell in the dark courtyard. The mountain was very quiet. She was aware of how close they were standing, closer than protocol required, closer than accident had arranged, exactly as close as two people stand when they have arrived at a space that is not yet named. He turned to look at her. She looked back. He said, "I find that I am not accustomed to wanting to tell people things." She said, "I know. I have noticed." He said, "Is it very obvious?" She said, "Only if you are looking." He said, "Are you looking?" She said yes. He was very still. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and touched her face. Not a seizing gesture, not claiming, just the back of two fingers against her cheekbone in a movement so careful it seemed like he was checking whether she was real. She did not move away. He said, very quietly, "This is not something I know how to do." She said, "I know. I am not sure I do either." He said, "I am not a simple man to know." She said, "I did not come here looking for a simple man." The fingers against her cheekbone moved slightly, a small, involuntary motion. He said, "What did you come here looking for?" She said, "An interesting correspondence." He made a sound. Not quite a laugh. But the precursor to one, warm, surprised, real. She had not heard it before. She thought she would like to hear it again. He said, "I think I can manage that." The snow continued to fall. The mountain continued to be quiet. And Serafina Calloway stood in the cold archway of a mountain estate with the most difficult man in the kingdom and thought that all of Lady Orvane's warnings had failed to account for the most obvious variable. That the dangerous thing about the Duke of Ashenvale was not his coldness. It was the warmth underneath it. The warmth that he had spent 20 years protecting. The warmth that, once glimpsed, made every other source of warmth in the world seem slightly pale by comparison. She had seen it by accident. On a mountain road, on a cold shoulder, in a moment of unguarded sleep. She had been looking ever since. What the snow kept and the spring released. They returned to Ashimere 5 days later than planned. The road crews had worked through 2 nights to clear the primary pass, and the carriages made the descent under a sky that had turned brilliant clear blue in the aftermath of the storm, the mountains white and sharp against it in a way that made the whole world look as though it had been freshly made. Serafina sat in the second carriage. She sat beside Lord Pethin, who fell asleep before the first switchback. Lady Orvane sat across from them, examining her correspondence. The Duke of Ashenvale sat beside Lady Orvane and did not sleep. He read. At measured intervals he looked up and out the window on Serafina's side of the carriage and described, briefly, what was coming. The valley before the third pass. The river gorge. The old watchtower on the ridge that dated to the First Kingdom period, 300 years ago. He said each of these things quietly, without ceremony, in the particular tone of a man who has discovered something he likes doing and is not yet prepared to be obvious about it. Lady Orvane turned pages and appeared to hear nothing. Seraphina looked at the valley, the river gorge, the old watchtower, and said small things back. What she noticed. What surprised her. Once, a hawk circling the ridge near the tower, banking in a long slow ellipse against the blue sky. He watched it too. She could tell without looking. They arrived at Ashimere in the late afternoon, the palace appearing first as a glitter of gold on the horizon as the road descended from the foothills, becoming stone and tower and gate as they drew closer, becoming home, she realized with mild surprise, in a way it had not quite been when she arrived 6 weeks ago. The following weeks were different. Not dramatically different. The architecture of court life did not change and the protocols did not bend, and on the surface everything proceeded as it always had. But underneath the surface something had shifted in the geography of the palace in a way that Seraphina felt, in the way she felt a change in the barometric pressure before rain, not visible yet, but present, real, altering the quality of the air. He began appearing in the palace library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He had always, she later learned, had access to the library. He had simply not used it on those specific days before. She had been in the library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings since her second week at the palace. She was working on the expansion of her great-uncle's maritime histories. The librarian was aware of this and had given her a dedicated table near the east window where the light was good. The Duke began using the table in the adjacent alcove. They did not speak much. They worked. Occasionally one of them would say something and the other would respond, and then they would return to their respective work. It was remarkably easy. Seraphina had spent considerable time in her life adjusting to the social expectations of other people's comfort, and she was not accustomed to shared silence that felt like rest rather than effort. With him it felt like rest. She told herself this was because they were both readers, both workers, both people for whom silence was a natural state. She told herself it was coincidence and proximity and the particular social arrangements of a royal court. She told herself a great many things, and none of them were wrong, exactly, but none of them were entirely the point. The point was that on the Thursday of the third week, when she arrived at the library and he was already there and looked up when she entered and said good morning in the particular way that was not his court voice but the other one, she felt something settle in her chest like a weight she had not known she was carrying setting itself down. She said good morning back. She sat at her table. She worked. She was happy. It took her another week to acknowledge this to herself clearly and without qualification, and another week after that to understand its shape well enough to know that it was not a thing she was going to be able to set aside when the season changed or the circumstances shifted. It was not the happiness of a pleasant posting or an interesting project. It was the happiness of a person who has found, entirely unexpectedly, someone whose company changes the quality of their world. She did not say this to him. She did not need to. She thought he knew. She thought he had known longer than she had. The conversation that changed everything happened in the third month. Not in the library. In the East Garden, in the brief golden window of early spring when the palace grounds bloomed all at once in an extravagance of white and pale pink, and the court came outside for the first time in months and spread across the lawns like everyone had forgotten they had legs. Serafina was walking the far eastern path, the one that ran beside the old stone wall and was less frequented because it required going slightly out of the way. She was not walking with purpose. She was thinking about a structural problem in the fourth chapter of her maritime history expansion that had been resisting solution for 2 weeks. She heard steps behind her and did not need to look. He fell into pace beside her. They walked for a minute without speaking. He said, "I spoke with my solicitor this week." She said, "About what?" He said, "About the Ashenvale estate records. There is a provision in the original title charter that I had not examined closely before. It pertains to the recognition of a duchess." She stopped walking. He stopped too. He was looking at the stone wall, not at her. He said, "The provision is not binding in the modern sense. I am aware of that. But I found myself examining it closely nonetheless. I found myself thinking about it for several days. I found myself, on reflection, thinking about very little else." She said nothing. He turned to look at her. He said, "I am not practiced at this. I am aware that I am not practiced at this. I am aware that I have a reputation and a history and a specific way of being in the world that is not particularly conducive to." He stopped. He tried again. "I am aware that I am a great deal to take on." She said, "I know. You told me. You said you were not a simple man to know." He said yes. She said, "I told you I did not come looking for a simple man." He said, "You also said you came looking for an interesting correspondence." She said, "And I found one." He said, "Serafina." The way he said her name was different from how anyone else said it. More deliberate. As though each syllable mattered. He said, "I am not asking because of court convention. I am not asking because of the charter provision. I am asking because I have been unable to read on Tuesday and Thursday mornings when you are absent. I am asking because you are the only person I have voluntarily told things to in a very long time. I am asking because you looked at me on a mountain road when everyone else looked away. And I would like the right to look back at you without it being a secret." She looked at him in the early spring light. His gray eyes. His still face. The warmth underneath it. She said, "That is a very good reason." He said, "Is it sufficient?" She said, "It is more than sufficient." The garden was very quiet. The blossoms on the stone wall moved slightly in the early spring air. He raised his hand and she remembered the covered walkway in the snowstorm and the back of 2 fingers against her cheekbone, checking whether she was real. His hand this time was open. His palm up. An invitation rather than a question. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. Careful, deliberate, certain. He said, very quietly, I would have written, you know. If I had not been able to speak to you directly. I would have written letters first. She said, I know. He said, how do you know? She said, because that is how you found me in the first place. And because some people think better on the page than they do out loud. He said, do you think that is what I am? She said, I think you are exactly what you are. And I think that is considerable. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the east garden of the royal palace of Ashimere, with the first spring blossoms opening on the old stone wall and the whole of the court spread across the lawns beyond them and not one person able to see them from this angle of the path, the Duke of Ashenvale, who had not smiled fully and without control and longer than he could cleanly remember, smiled. It was remarkable. She thought she would spend a very long time earning it again, and she found, with absolute clarity, that she did not mind this at all. He was the most dangerous man in the kingdom. He had been warned about before she arrived. He had been described in terms of coldness and walls and calculated distance and the particular genius of a man who never let anything past his defenses. He had fallen asleep on her shoulder on a mountain road. He had asked about her before he met her. He had described a second mountain pass and an old watchtower and a hawk banking on the blue air because he had found something he liked doing and was not ready yet to be obvious about it. He was not what the warning said. He was what the warmth underneath said. And Seraphina Calloway, the second daughter of a minor coastal family, the ink-stained correspondent of a royal librarian, the woman who had walked into the wrong corridor on her 5th day at court and lost her books and found, entirely without planning for it, the beginning of everything, pressed her fingers against his and held on. The spring moved through the garden. The world was new. And the Duke of Ashenvale, who had spent 20 years learning to need nothing and no one, walked back toward the palace with his hand holding hers and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, something release in his chest, some knot of careful, contained, protected tension, releasing. Letting the warmth come through. He had not known it could feel like this. He thought, carefully, privately, looking at the side of her face as they walked, that perhaps he had simply been waiting for the right correspondent. He thought she probably knew that. He did not tell her. He would tell her in a letter. That was how some people said the most important things. That was how they had always found each other. On the page. In the words that lasted. The end.